Welcome to We Need to Talk About, a thing where I talk about the things that I think we need to talk about. Today, we need to talk about them. Now, when I'm talking about them, I mean the way in which people generalize about groups and use it to make moralistic justifications of actions against the whole group. In this episode, I will discuss this in broad terms, outline the ways in which Israel relies on treating the people of Gaza as a monolithic them to justify its genocide, and finish with a few um, uh, observations on what it means to the future. So I'll start now with them as in the generalized them that gets applied to people who share an identity and thus are lumped with shared guilt or shared animus. This is a process usually associated with racism, but can be part of any sort of bigotry or prejudice. Part of the inspiration for this episode was realizing that when I talked about anti-Semitism in my last podcast, I largely left out any sort of description of this sort of online anti-Semitism that is getting more and more common nowadays. Instead, I got a little bit sidetracked talking about Hitler and the surprising rise of Hitler fans on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. I do think that we have a lot of online anti Semitism, and it is being seen in Palestine solidarity circles. And I just want to say that we need to stop sharing or boosting any instances, but also to stop following accounts that use anti Semitic words or imagery. To me, that is one of the most striking things about this is the blatant use of like visual imagery with caricatures and hook noses and this sort of stuff, which is has a historic resonance for me, or for a lot of people, not just me, of course. It is linked to the horrors of the Holocaust, and I don't really think that you have to have some special Zionist brainwashing to find this sort of thing really disturbing. It is really disturbing. It's not just that some people have been taught that Jewish suffering is greater than other people's suffering. It's offensive and disturbing in its own right. And there is something particularly revolting about racial caricatures, whether it's buck-toothed, bespectacled Japanese people or thick-lipped, watermelon-eating black people. These are direct incitements to despise and hate others, and as such, they're also incitements to inflict violence or to at least treat violence as a much more palatable option because they are dehumanizing and they do provoke gut level instinctual responses of hostility that often one wouldn't actually feel with confronted with a real person. The exaggerated differences activate something quite ugly in people, that might come from an instinctual place. But again, when you're facing a real person, you wouldn't necessarily see them the same way. Um, and if you do get some sort of positive feeling from seeing um, racial caricatures because you you have it's because you have some sort of desire to feel hatred, and so admittedly, this might come from a feeling that some people are actually actively persecuting you, so you want to see hateable side of them. But it's still an unhealthy side of your personality to let out. And at the same time, moving away from the caricatures, I think that anything that uses slurs is also disturbing. I'm not going to go through particular words that might be used, but if anyone ever uses deliberately hateful terms for Jewish people as a whole, rather than referring to a particular person's politics and or the actions or anything specific to the individual. It's not just a moral duty, but a very sensible thing to remove them from your timelines and from your online world altogether. I can't believe how many people I see sharing stuff or continuing to follow accounts that use slurs just because they happen to support Palestine. Half or more of these people are probably Hasbara trolls trying to infect the Palestine solidarity world with anti-Semitism, because that fuels the Zionist excuse for those who oppose Zionist violence. That those who oppose Zionist violence only do so because they're anti-Semitic. So people who actually do use anti-Semitism to criticize Israel are really doing the job of the Zionists for them in that respect. And I think it obviously harming the Palestinian cause as well. And I don't want to go into it in great detail, but of course I understand that people who've suffered under Zionism directly, who've been personally hurt or seen their loved ones hurt or killed by people who proudly display the Star of David and claim that they are from the Jewish state. I mean, I understand if that causes them to develop anti-Semitic sentiments, and I'm not going to condemn them for that, but I definitely don't think you should tolerate it from people who haven't felt any direct violence. And I think also that, if we want to help the people of Palestine, we should support them to move away from anti-Semitic sentiments for, for their own good in the long term, as well as everyone else's. And it's not just about slurs either, and that's why this all ties into the topic of the conversation I'm having today. Or actually, it's a monologue, not a conversation, but I'll call it a conversation. I am talking about generalizations and saying that a whole people is responsible for something that some of them do. So I find it extraordinary in this day and age that it needs to even be said that you can't hold all of the people responsible for what only a certain number of them do. And yet it is incredibly common online. Maybe more so for victims of Zionism than it is for Jewish people being blamed for the actions of Zionists. So, for example, many people blame all Jews for things that Israel does, but it seems far more common at the moment in the West to see all Palestinians or all Palestinians living in Gaza or all Lebanese to be blamed for the actions of some people from those places. And when I say blamed, I'm not saying that they are claiming that all of those people collectively got together and gathered around to shoot off rockets or whatever. What they're saying is that they all deserve to be treated as guilty parties, that they share some culpability, and that it is morally justified to act against them in the same manner as if they are all guilty. So the obvious example is the killing of people in Gaza, which when Israel kills people in Gaza, when the Zionists are saying that people deserve it because, for example, they could have just handed the hostages back, which is a fundamentally insane thing to say, because it's not as if the civilian people that they're killing are holding the hostages. In fact, it makes no sense on several levels, because if you cared about the hostages, you wouldn't be bombing the people who were holding the hostages, because that would, of course, lead to the hostages being killed. But, this is more or less what is the Israeli government has been doing, and hostages have been killed through this bombing. But there are also, the fact is, and let's put things in proportion, there are less than 100 surviving hostages. I mean, some estimates, I think, are that only 70 remain alive. And more Palestinians in Gaza are dying every day than that. If you count those who are dying of disease and preventable disease and complications from malnutrition, exposure, and so forth. And it's every day for a very long time, hundreds and hundreds of times over. Well, just over a year now. So, even though Israeli violence endangers and often kills the hostages, they still talk somehow as if all the people who are killed are involved in taking those hostages, keeping those hostages, or have a choice about the hostages in some unspoken way. And this is part of the danger of this generalization of calling a people a them or a they and spreading the blame according to an identity. In that respect, one of the things I want to talk about is genocide, which was a term originally coined by a guy called Raphael Lemkin. Now, in things I've read, Lemkin wasn't very specific about the theoretical underpinnings of the idea of genocide, but you still get hints. So one of the things he pointed out was that he used the word pragmatic and pointed out that genocide revolved around the idea of a genos, which is a group described as being a collectivity which has a kind of shared culture. And he particularly liked that term because Plato used it to refer to a religious community. So he felt that you could use it for religious, genetic, or what we would consider now ethnic and cultural aspects or potentialities for a group. So it was broad in that sense, but like broad but identifiable groupings. So Lemkin used the word pragmatic because he was talking about the fact that a genos is the victim of a genocide, but also a genos is the perpetrator. The pragmatic aspect is the very real knowledge that the identity of the other can make them hostile if relations become inimical between the two. So if you're an identifiable genus, they're an identifiable genus, if you become enemies, each will mutually see attach that idea of enemy and hostility to the genus as a whole. So the identity of the other means that there is a collective identity and thus they're collective enemies. And then it makes a kind of strategic sense for one genus to attempt to destroy in whole or part the other genus. For example, if you go back to ancient times, for example, you might decide to take warfare against an enemy a step further so that you maybe disable the next generation, the sons of the people you're killing now, from seeking revenge against your sons. It all kind of makes a sort of sense, and this is the kind of logic that feeds into genocide. In some ways, obviously, this made a lot more sense in the past when identity could be more insular, depending on the time and place, of course, because this is by no means universal. Most times and places, people can be fluid about their identity and they can blend. They aren't necessarily always antagonistic over ideas of identity. In fact, it often happens that conflict is just a phase of relation. Armed conflict is just a phase of relations between peoples, and even if there's conquest, it often becomes a vehicle of cultural exchange, which could be more or less violent, more or less coercive. And I'm not trying to say it was nice or anything, but the point is it's not genocidal. It's not one group seeking to wipe out the identity of the other to any extent, greater or larger. In fact, sometimes you'd have conquerors coming in and becoming the absorbed party. They would take over at the top politically. Often there'd be quite a gender disparity with only males being part of this, and then they would absorb the local culture, intermarry, take on the language, and so forth, and more or less disappear into the people they'd conquered. However, there is still a strategic sense to committing genocide that exists even to this day, and it is very much linked to this idea of generalizing the identity of the other. With today, now with the barriers of language, of culture, and mutual comprehensibility easily overcome, we don't, however, have a situation where it's truly pragmatic in the same sense that it used to be. However, what we have now is a situation where it becomes more about political leadership weaponizing ideas of identity for their own interests, for their own power, their own sense of control, which can be partly about not just about dominating the victim group, it can be about dominating your own people as well by mobilizing them against the other, creating this enemy. So genocide is now more in the realm of those with grandiose ambitions, those who won't accept and who cannot accept the idea that their power might be challenged or shared, or simply don't want to. So those are the people who are in some ways living in a fantasy, creating a fantasy that they're living back in those times where a genos would be a tribe where the sons of the tribe would potentially kill your own sons and so forth. It's artificial in that sense. And I mean, it's basically a form of crackpot realism where people see others as a threat and think that any potential threat must be an actual threat. And the only way you can have security is to become dominant and to be able to coerce the other with no possibility of resistance. So this is some sort of strategic approach that the Japanese were inclined towards leading up to World War II. They couldn't see themselves as being secure without achieving dominance. And I just want to have a bit of a reality check here because because we tend to put these powerful, aggressive nations at the forefront of our thinking. But the reality is most people live in polities that don't have the choice of pursuing that sort of hegemonic, coercive relationship. And even regionally, most people live in polities that establish peer relationships with each other. And of course, I'm sure there's a lot of nasty realpolitik that goes on. And shit definitely flows downhill. We know this. But it's not quite the same as this sort of this genocidal impulse to dominate, and then the intolerance of any sort of challenge to one's power. So the number one example of that sort of thinking would be the United States in the post-World War II era. And its approach to the entire globe has been to establish military hegemony. In later times, they have openly referred to this as full spectrum dominance. But in reality, the Cold War was essentially a system where there was a Soviet bloc that was like a healthy dwarf competitor, and its existence was used by the US as a pretext for dominating all the areas outside of that Soviet bloc. And it didn't just allow it to form, to exert military domination and strategic domination, but also the domination of capital, of economic domination as well. Because any nationalist political movement that sought to constrain US capital was labeled communist and then treated as a military threat, which then allowed the US to use overt or covert violent action to remove them. So, whether that's necessarily always genocidal is a moot point, really. But what I would say is that the most urgent examples that seem to worry the US the most were places with strong national identities, where the left-wing tendencies were more pluralistic. They were much more comfortable with authoritarian leftists, if that's not too much of an oxymoron, than they were with people like the Sandinistas or the Viet Minh or the NLF, who had both a strong national sense and also had coalitions where the left were leaders, the communists rather were leaders rather than the entirety of the political movement. So these sorts of formations form the greatest threat. So the threat, of course, is someone you cannot control. That's what was considered a threat, and therefore that and also this is what really the domino theory was about. It wasn't about like the Soviet empire spreading. It was about the example of success, economic and political success in places like Vietnam, prompting others to break away from the so-called free world. Anyway, so starting with the war in Korea, in fact, starting before the war in Korea, starting with the repression of leftist movements in Jeju-do and in South Korea, the southern part of South Korea, the US embarked on a series of genocidal interventions throughout the world. This approach gives a kind of strategic imperative for othering, which is basically othering as making a them, exactly what I'm talking about here in this episode. Hence my long digression about genocide and empire. Anyway, the process of othering is crucial to empires and empire building because, the that is really what this so-called free world was. It was a US empire, and basically we're still living with it. It's changed a little bit. It's expanded, if anything. It's maybe there's more contestation and less containment of the rivals, but it's still a US empire. Um, Although parts of it, I mean, the nodes of power could be in other countries as well. Could be just about anywhere a billionaire lives, really, in some respects. But the nation state and its military, the U.S. nation state and its military and its centers in Washington D.C., New York, and Los Angeles, in particular, are really the centers of the empire. It's not. It's a complicated empire. It's not It's not like I mean, previous empires have also been quite complicated, but this is a whole other level of complication. It's not one ethno-state just dominating a bunch of other ethno-states, but it is still centered in the US, and the people who feel the oppressive boot on their neck are feeling a boot made in the US of A. So this obviously has a strong relevance to what is happening in Israel and Palestine. And I'm not the only person in the world who thinks that the current genocide in Palestine, now spreading to Lebanon, is part of a system of divide and rule aimed at dominating the region, dominating the petroleum-rich region, by ensuring that there is a permanent state of conflict between Israel and its neighbors. Now, I wrote a piece, and I'll post a link to it, talking about the British interest in creating Israel as a way of having a permanent source of conflict, a means of creating a divide and rule system in the Middle East. And of course, this has been taken up by the US. And there's another, I just read another article recently, which I'll also post, by a Sri Lankan guy called Indrajit Samarajiva, who has written a more contemporary version of that, which I found quite interesting. So I'll post that in the description. But yeah, anyway, they have created this new national entity, a nation state with a strong, if not maybe fanatical, national identity linked to a specific ethnic identity that is quite interesting. Of course, Jewishness, quite diverse, but a way of, because you could be religious or you could be a cultural Jewish person, and historically some of the Jewish people in Israel were not closely linked. But I'm not going to go into how they all ended up there. The point is that it's a very convenient way of creating a strong nation-state identity that is separate and easily made hostile to the people surrounding it, particularly the Arab peoples who happen to live on top of the oil that is so valued. So, this divide and rule process um, revolves around a creating a them, and this um, once you create the them, then you know create the generalizations, and often this is linked to processes we refer to as dehumanization. So when we think of dehumanization, we often are going to think of demonizing people, portraying them as animals, as Untermensch, subhuman, that sort of thing. But you can actually dehumanize people simply by failing to treat them as human, by omitting their humanity. And this is a Western speciality, really, to talk about certain people and their sufferings and their deaths as being somehow natural and definitely less meaningful than those of Westerners. So there's really obvious racist examples of this, such as British Air Commander Hugh Trenchard in 1930, who told the UK Parliament that Iraqi tribesmen, quote, enjoy fighting for fighting's sake and have no objection to being killed, end quote. And of course, there's also General William Westmoreland, who commanded US forces in Indochina for a number of years at the height of the war. And he said that for Asians, life was, quote, plentiful and cheap, end quote. So this is the Western style of saying that emotions aren't as real for other people as they are for us, which comes out of a class-based system that always devalued the experience, the humanity of poor people. But we can now receive this reflected very much in the reportage of lives lost in Palestine and Lebanon. And we can definitely see a strange thing that happened after October the 7th when Piers Morgan, for example, was asked how many Palestinians' lives is it right to take in order for each Israeli life lost. I think it was Bassem Youssef who asked him, actually. And Piers Morgan took that as a serious question and was like, yes, how many is it right to kill? How many, what quantum? And it's like he thinks he was doing a real life trolley problem instead of dropping fucking 2,000-pound bombs on children, and he would never have thought that Palestinians should be able to kill a certain number of innocent Israelis so as to because they say they're protecting Palestinian civilians from future attacks. I mean, teaching the Israelis a lesson about what happens if you attack us, sort of thing, or whatever the rationales they use. I mean, the very idea of saying you could kill a certain amount of innocent people on one side because a certain amount of innocent people on the other side need to be saved from future killing is like it only makes sense if you don't think one side is really human. But they don't really, but they try to erode the sense that there is such a thing as an innocent Palestinian. I mean, there's plenty of Israeli politicians who will say there are no innocent Palestinians. And by creating this generalized identity, again, at the risk of repeating myself, of course, you're basically saying that some of them are responsible for all of them are responsible, for the actions of some of them. And this is really key part of Zionist apologism for genocide. The shared guilt is essential, and they need to be tainted by connection to October the 7th. In fact, there are really only 4 justifications that Zionists seem to be able to use for this genocide. None of them actually work very well, but what works is that they switch between them according to the circumstances. So the first, obviously, is the cliche Israel's right to defend itself. Now, I won't get into that because it's not really relevant to this topic, but I will link to, if anyone's interested, I will link to an article I wrote, Israel's Big Lie of Self-Defense. There are other people, of course, who've also dealt with this and debunked the claims to a self-defense right by Israel, including, I think, prominently Noura Erakat, and of late Craig McIver has mentioned it quite a lot. So their stuff is well worth checking out. But the other 3 justifications used all have some sort of tendency towards creating this collective them. And one which isn't used in the Western media a lot, but I gather is used in Israel, is that because the people in Gaza voted for Hamas, they're all guilty. Like, this vote happened quite a long time ago now. And anyway, I mean, I also see, just as an aside for a second, I see people talking very similarly about Israelis, that they look at polls and so forth, and like see that 79% support ethnic cleansing, and 63% support raping prisoners and so forth like that. And they generalize about Israelis, saying they're all guilty, sometimes wishing death on all of them, and that sort of thing. Not usually, admittedly, but definitely espousing collective guilt for all Israelis, and often using dehumanizing language. So even if they're not being like anti-Semitic specifically, even if they're not referencing a problem with Jewish people as such, just sticking to calling Israelis such and such, it still seems to ignore the fact that there are babies, Israeli children, there are Israeli peace activists, there are brave anti-Zionist Israelis, people who are not to blame. So, I mean, even the worst Zionists, in a way, they didn't choose to be born into a country and then brainwashed about the fact that everyone else in the world hates them and the Palestinians are animals and all of that sort of thing. They. So, I mean, and I'm sure, being brainwashed in that way doesn't make for a happy life, I'd imagine. I mean, in a way, people who think it's okay to hate Israelis because Israelis are these well-armed people committing a genocide at the moment, in a way that's kind of repeating the mistake that Zionists did in a lot of people did in tolerating Zionism as well in the late 1940s by ignoring the problems of a new form of chauvinistic bigotry, often attached to already pretty well developed hatred of Arabs and Palestinians, ignoring it because something so monstrous had happened in Europe. So we can't just, we have to maintain our standards regardless of what might be going on. You don't just start blaming. You don't create your own them because certain other people are creating a them and then committing genocide. Anyway, so going back to the argument used against the civilian population of Gaza, the specifics of the argument were dissected quite entertainingly by Sammy Obeid, the comedian, and I can't find a link to that, but well, I haven't looked hard enough. So you could probably find it yourself if you want, but anyway, he does a comedy routine, goes through the mathematics, because he does mathematical stuff, and shows that something like about 7% of the people living in Gaza at the moment voted for Hamas, and that's it. So the whole guilt by electoral mandate argument, which has been used for other peoples in other places as well, is really just a cheap excuse for a deeper racist belief. And in this case, the deep racist belief that Palestinians are monstrous by nature. This is, I'll touch on this again because this sort of bigotry is obviously central to the topic of this conversation. Well, again, it's not a conversation. I'm only speaking. It's a monologue, but episode. And at this point, I just want to say that every Zionist, every supporter of Israel's government, and every apologist up to and including those who seek to both sides of the issue, every one of those people I've ever encountered is racist about Palestinians or they're Islamophobic. And I think the relationship between this bigotry and Zionism isn't just a simple one of cause and effect. These are mutually reinforcing things. If you have a pre-existing prejudice, you'll find more gratification in supporting Israel in their fight against the savage Arab peoples, or savage Islamic peoples. But if you support Israel, cultivating this sort of bias will create an ideological safe harbor, a psychological safe harbor for you, a place for you to hide from the cognitive dissonance you might feel about your side's violence and the impossibility of ethically defending apartheid and genocide. The reason Zionists don't like to look at violence in quantitative terms is that they can create a much safer picture for themselves with qualitative, subjective assertions about certain violence being more savage and more brutal and more essential to the perpetrator. This is, of course, just a type of crypto-racism, and it functions to divert the mind not just from concerns of which side actually commits the most violence, but also from issues of legality and even chronology. So the sense, for example, has been said that they act as if nothing can justify October the 7th, but October the 7th can justify anything. It relies on this suggestion of qualitative barbarism that somehow that was, you can't add up the people and then say, well, why are you saying this violence is worse when you've killed a lot more people than that in the previous 2 years, and certainly afterwards, obviously. And this isn't even new to October the 7th. So, for example, rocket attacks from Gaza were always understood as reasons for Israel to strike back, but they were never understood as themselves being retaliation or defense or anything like that to do with Israeli violence, which they frequently, obviously they were prompted by acts of Israeli violence almost, well, as far as I know, always. They were in retaliation for Israeli acts. So, and yeah, the next justification they use is their repeated lie that Hamas are using human shields. And in a way, this is a tricky way of saying two things at once. One is that they're trying to imply that Hamas are committing a war crime, the crime of using human shields, which is prohibited, and the other is trying to evoke the discourse that they can't fight the people who hide amongst the civilian population without killing a lot of civilians. So they kind of conflate these two ideas. So they're using the phrase human shields to kind of both inaccurately imply that there's a war crime being committed and to reference their established discourse about how hard their asymmetric warfare is and why they need to kill lots of civilians. And this is a type of generalizing propaganda because it really is part of a larger process of trying to efface the legal principle of distinction between combatants and non-combatants. This is also, this is nothing new as well. As you can imagine, this is something that was crucial to the US. Anyone who's familiar with any of their discourse about Iraq or Indochina will know that they're very much concerned with how you can't tell the difference between a civilian and a combatant and so forth. Anyway, it's part of a kind of broader effort to create a sense of fluidity between who is and who isn't an armed enemy, and who is a legitimate target for military violence. So during the Cold War in Latin America, they had these kind of my tongue's not working. Taxonomical lists of leftists and intellectuals, and they call them things like fellow traveller or useful idiot, or you go right from communist and then through to various degrees of to socialist or social democrat and so forth. And so they were basically, you can use this as a sliding scale, a bit like maybe Israel's algorithms for deciding who they can legitimately kill. You can loosen the criteria so that you go down that scale and say, well, now, we go after these people. But they're all like, they're all for, these are all categories that a right-wing authoritarian government can use to tell their own people, their own security forces, that all of them belong to a single enterprise. They are a them, and that single enterprise wants violent revolution followed by totalitarian rule. And so they could then, give people these criteria and use them to generate lists for death squads. And those criteria could become very, very loose. And in Vietnam, for example, is another example. The US invented the term Viet Cong, Cong meaning communist. And it was a way of conflating all communists together. And of course, being a communist just means you have an ideological belief. It doesn't mean that you've got a rifle. But they tried to create this term that would legitimize treating all people with an ideology as legitimate armed enemies. So the term was actually applied to the National Liberation Front, which included people who weren't even communists anyway. And over time, though, it became, by custom, it became the term you use to refer to the People's Liberation Armed Forces, the actual the military arm of the National Liberation Front. So, having had their deliberately vague term become more and more associated with actual people with guns, the US then invented another term, which was Viet Cong infrastructure, or VCI. And infrastructure, in this case, was people who were the people who were part of the governing systems of the NLF, who governed quite large parts of rural South Vietnam. So now they're calling people infrastructure, which is probably a pinnacle in dehumanization, because you're not even calling people animals anymore. You're basically saying they're like roading or pipes or street lamps or something. So Viet Cong infrastructure shares a lot of characteristics in this sense from the way Israel uses the term Hamas or Hamas to refer to people like administrators, police, teachers, and so forth. Anyone on a government payroll, anyone associated with the administration is treated as if they're a combatant. And this feeds and legitimates the proliferation of violence through, in the end, what is a willful paranoia that sees everyone as a threat. And we're back again to this kind of crackpot realism that feeds into genocidal impulses, which is, it could be paranoid or it could be controlling. And it can be a mix of both. The VCI, for example, were the main target of the notorious Phoenix program, which tortured and murdered tens of thousands of people and used the torture to generate the intelligence to find more targets, which you can imagine is a nightmare scenario where reality is just not even part of the calculus anymore. And because they didn't even bother with, they call them VCI, an acronym, and acronyms have a way of creating a level of abstraction as well, which, I think is why Orwell had so many of them in 1984. In fact, he probably even mentions it in there. They hide power, and they're a common link, I think, that Orwell saw between places like Nazi Germany and the British Empire, and between the Soviet Union and the US military. And the US military is probably the greatest example of an acronym generating system that the world has ever known. Like, for example, I could say the CIC and the RVN was the Commerce Mac V, it's all jargon, really. It's meant to stop people from outside from understanding, but it's also meant to take away meaning from things so that they become empty signifiers, basically. So So once people were nothing but VCI, then of course the criteria get looser. You're torturing people, asking them for new suspects. You've got a system, you've got targets. This is a bureaucratized process. And then, the criteria get looser and looser until you're pretty much picking up people and killing them for being an intellectual, or in some cases for wearing glasses. So, yeah, I mean, all political language is either by design or by custom, it becomes slippery. So you can use existing terms like saying Hamas are terrorists, Hezbollah are terrorists are bad people who can be killed legitimately. Therefore, if I say a kindergarten teacher is Hamas, then I can kill them. Right? And it's morally defensible because Hamas are terrorists. And this is a quintessential part of genocide. It's been also a normal practice for the US and Israel to cultivate and support the armed opposition that helps them create this idea of a shared identity that has a combatant, a violent aspect to it, which legitimates their own actions. So I don't want to digress too much into this, but anyone who seeks to commit genocide benefits from having an armed enemy that is maintained throughout the process of genocide. So in Vietnam and Iraq and now in Gaza, the US and Israel have been very crucial in incentivizing people to join armed resistance groups, and also in financing and arming them to some extent as well. So, I will probably return to that topic in other episodes. But I'll move on now to the next justification for using the slaughter in Gaza, and that is to implicate everyone by saying that they could, as I said before, stop this all by releasing the hostages now. I've already talked about why this is ridiculous in several senses, but it also relies on what the Israeli government says it's going to do, and because they have said that they will keep the what they call a war, actually the operation, whatever they call it, hostilities will not end with the release of the hostages. But ignoring that, there is also a massive generalization here that is of a type that is as common as it is vapid. So I mentioned earlier that the people killed and maimed are not actually holding the hostages, and to suggest that they have some collective agency is as stupid as it is monstrous, really. But it's only the latest in a long tradition of using nonsense generalizations to justify genocidal violence aimed at all Palestinians as such. Indeed, the whole point of generalizations of that type is that they create a pretext for violence against people. And those people, the genuine reason or the effective reason for acting violently towards them is their membership in a national group, a national or ethnic group. These are protected categories under the United Nations Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So, there is this long tradition of treating Palestinians as a monolith, as though even though they are stateless and they're dispersed and they're subjects with often, varying degrees of political rights of different governments in different places. Some of those governments are committing or abetting genocide against Palestinians. But so it seems particularly, particularly evil to treat them as one in that sense. But some of the generalizations have a really nauseating tenor to them, because they tend to portray Palestinians as victims of their own irrationality and savage hatred, and use that as the excuse or the explanation for Israeli violence. So, of course, they used to avoid calling Palestinians Palestinians. They call them Arabs instead, which is kind of changing a little bit now, especially since they want to be friends with certain Arabs. And, so they're starting to admit that Palestinians are a thing. But, I just want to give some examples from the past where they were referred to as Arabs, but, the meaning is still there. So we got Golda Meir. We can forgive the Arabs for killing our children. We cannot forgive them for forcing us to kill their children. We will only have peace with the Arabs when they love their children more than they hate us. And then an Israeli diplomat also said, the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity. So they it's a really quite a horrible thing for this heavily armed country that commits acts of violence against these people, that is has an ongoing plan of dispossession for these people from their land. That they're like, oh, but you could have peace. And along those lines, I think more recently there's the Ta-Nehisi Coates appearance on CBS Mornings, which a lot of people might have seen, and the guy who was being quite an arsehole on that, called Mike Tocopel, and he said something that maybe other people found less offensive than some of the other things he said, because the other things were rude about Ta-Nehisi Coates. But I found this way more offensive. He accused Coates of denying Palestinians agency because he had portrayed them as, quote, merely victims of the Israelis, as though they were not offered peace at any juncture, end quote. And what the fuck is that? Does he think that Palestinians are offered peace when they're born, and they just rejected, or that they reach a certain age and someone comes over and says, look, here's this piece of paper, tick here if you want peace, tick there if you don't, and they just tend to go, no, I don't want peace, I hate peace? What the fuck is he on about? I mean, their leaders haven't really rejected peace either. They've often been asked to basically capitulate to everything, and if anything, the worst thing that they've done is to make concessions that have made it easier for violence to continue. So this is, anyway, that's a whole other topic, but let's just get back to, let's ignore Palestinian leaders and concentrate on the Palestinian them. And I mean, the reality is that Palestinians want peace more than, well, probably more than Israelis want, because they suffer more than Israelis want. And to suggest otherwise is just racism, because it suggests that they have some intrinsic self-destructive hatred that makes them choose their own oppression when they have like this other choice, which is just to go, oh no, I'll have peace instead. Of course they'd choose that if they had that option. It reminds me really of a disgusting habit of suggesting there was something intrinsic to Jews that made them passive in a way that helped the Germans kill so many of them. And they didn't. They reacted the way you or I would, because we are the same fucking species. We're all humans. We do. This is what we do. The Germans weren't stupid. I mean, they had all the guns, they had all the power, they had organization, and they were always like, they would never have they did whatever they could to avoid provoking people into outright resistance where it was a danger to them. Like the Palestinians of today, these people were faced with an impossibly stronger enemy, and that enemy had less restraint even than the Israelis, who now gleefully record their own war crimes and post them online. So, I mean, there is one respect in which, there are similarities in some aspects, though, because I think you could fairly say that both the Germans under Nazism and the Israelis today were masters of using sane methods for insane ends. In the end, though, neither those Germans nor Israelis chose to be who they are. Even if you believe in the free will of the individual, which is a very dubious notion, there can be no serious assertion that entire peoples have free will. No? We are all the same shitty organic fucking machines. Our basic nature is all the same. So our job is to fix things, not to pick people out and blame them. So we're in a fight now, and we need to win it, because that was forced on us. There's no moderating what's happening now. The genocide has gone too far, but we're not fighting to vanquish. We're not fighting to punish people. Hatred and blame are for self-gratification. We need to fight to establish the truth, not our own dominance, the dominance of justice and truth. Otherwise, we're just going to see what's happening now become the germ, the seed of future violence. And people will willfully blind themselves to the suffering of other people in the future, because they'll be creating a sentimental sense of what has happened here in this genocide. And that is what has happened before. So, in the end, there is really only one them, and that is us. So on that note, I'll finish this episode with a quick reading list. So while, I've touched on othering and that sort of thing, so I would recommend, obviously, the classic Edward Said's Orientalism, which, it's not about othering in general. It's a specific examination, but it is a very important one. Now, I mentioned 1984. This is a satire. If you're a sick enough person, you'll even find it funny at times. I mean, Orwell certainly takes the piss out of journalists, and that's always good value. But I also recommend to kind of maybe prep you a bit for reading 1984, reading his essay Politics in the English Language that he wrote, I think, maybe a year before. And it clearly shows that some of his thinking about the use of language and the way narratives are controlled is important in 1984. Now, there's some stuff in it which he gives he's pretty prescriptive about how people should write, and I think just ignore that. Personally, I mean, he has a go at people for using the phrase status quo, for example. I don't think that that's his real strength. I think people can write in all sorts of styles validly, but the strength of it is his exposure of people's use of language to conceal meaning. So yeah, I think that's worth reading. Now, also I mentioned Raphael Lemkin. You can find on my website on genocide.com. I have Chapter 9 of Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, which was where he first laid out his definition of genocide. It's the first published use of the term. And also there's a memoir that you can get that he never finished, and unfortunately it's got unsatisfying, he died sadly, unsatisfying gaps and so forth, but it is a very interesting read. So he, did I say it's called Totally Unofficial? Yeah. So, I mean, I guess that gives a bit of an insight into his mindset. And also, anyone who was intrigued by me talking about the way people committing genocide will arm an opposing, or cause to be armed, cause to exist, an armed resistance, and support them as a way of legitimating attacks, genocidal attacks on the civilian population. Obviously that's a bit of an oversimplification there, but it is quite an important ingredient of a lot of genocide, I would say. But anyway, if you are intrigued by that idea, you can also go to ongenocide.com and find my own work, Beyond Stalemate, where I discuss the way in which that occurred in Indochina under when the US was waging genocide there. So thank you for tuning in or downloading or whatever you call it, and I will be back again with another podcast in a very irregular time, probably far too far apart to be good for my visibility and my future career, but I just do them when I can. Okay, well, thanks again, and see you next time.